California is facing an unprecedented marine ecological disaster. A native species is devastating the seafloor, transforming it into an ecological desert. In 2017, researcher Joshua Smith and his colleagues descended to the ocean floor to conduct their 236th survey. Over the course of 3 years, at every dive site, the team carefully placed 1 square meter survey frames to count sea urchins both in the open and inside rocky crevices, while assessing the damage they had caused. The results grew worse with each survey. Smith said millions of zombie urchins were covering the seafloor. But by the 3rd year, Smith made a startling discovery. Just a short distance from the dead zone, towering kelp columns nearly 100 feet tall were still thriving. Schools of rockfish moved through the forest, and color was gradually returning to the seafloor. According to conventional understanding, this remarkable sight should have been impossible, unless something had intervened. Smith and his research team went back through every piece of data to see whether they had missed something. But in reality, the answer had already appeared 80 years earlier. It was a small, dark-furred creature that Life magazine once described as an extinct creature comes back to life. And now, the recovery of the ocean would depend on that very animal. To understand why California's marine ecosystem fell out of balance, we have to go back to 1742, when survivors of Vitus Bering's expedition brought sea otter pelts back to Russia. Their fur, the densest of any mammal, kept them warm without the need for a thick layer of fat. It quickly became a luxury product, triggering a brutal wave of hunting across the North Pacific. Russian, British, American, and other hunters killed sea otters in enormous numbers, while indigenous Aleut people were forced to take part in the hunts. After nearly 170 years, a global population of around 300,000 sea otters had been reduced to just 13 small groups, each containing only about 10 to 100 animals. In California, everyone believed that sea otters had disappeared completely. The species that benefited most from the disappearance of sea otters was probably the purple sea urchin. With no natural threat left, they emerged from rocky crevices, formed massive feeding fronts, and crawled across the seafloor. After analyzing 22 years of data from Monterey, Joshua Smith and Tim Tinker discovered that sea urchins had not only increased in number, but had also changed their behavior. Using a 5-toothed feeding structure known as Aristotle's lantern, sea urchins bite into the holdfasts that anchor kelp to the seafloor. This is also one of their favorite foods. Once the holdfast is damaged, kelp plants that can grow up to 165 feet tall break free from the bottom, drift away with the currents, and eventually die. By the 1960s, kelp forests had been transformed into urchin barrens, where the seafloor was covered in purple and the water appeared unusually clear because almost no life remained. In Northern California, more than 95% of the kelp canopy disappeared. Rockfish lost their shelter, lingcod lost their hunting grounds, and seals and sea lions lost important feeding habitat. Red abalone also lost their food supply, forcing the recreational abalone diving fishery to close in 2018. That closure is now expected to remain in place until at least 2036. By the 1970s, marine biologists in California had begun replanting kelp in areas that had already turned into urchin barrens. Divers attached young kelp to weighted discs on the seafloor, while government agencies funded underwater planting machines. The kelp could survive for several weeks, sometimes even a few months, but the sea urchins always found it and ate it all. This was only a temporary solution. It still failed to address the underlying cause of the kelp's disappearance. Later, they also recognized this critical problem. In 2020, the state spent nearly $500,000 on a project at Noyo Bay and Casper Cove. Divers descended to the seafloor, crushing and collecting sea urchins by hand. Over 2 years, nearly 50,000 pounds of sea urchins were removed, reducing their density to fewer than 2 per square meter. Kelp at Noyo Bay began to recover, but the project succeeded only on a small scale. 18 months later, the sea urchin population rebounded. A 2021 report concluded that manual removal could not be applied across the entire coastline. Every method had reached a dead end, while the United States continued losing its marine ecosystem day by day. Everything began to change in 1938, when a small group of sea otters was discovered near Big Sur, south of Carmel, in the waters around Point Sur Lighthouse. There were only 13 of them. Life magazine featured the discovery on its front page, calling them an extinct creature comes back to life. But that was not what had happened. The otters had never truly disappeared. They had simply been hiding from fur hunters. Those 13 sea otters were placed under state and federal protection and then left alone. They ate sea urchins, not because anyone told them to, and not because a biologist had studied the urchin-barren problem and concluded that controlling sea urchins with otters should become a priority. They ate sea urchins simply because that is what sea otters do. They had been eating sea urchins for 10 million years. They knew exactly where the urchins were hiding. They knew how to break open their shells. And they were faster, more persistent, and far more effective than any team of divers working with hammers. Scientists who observed what happened next gave the phenomenon a name, a trophic cascade. But simply giving the phenomenon a name does not explain it. This is what actually happens. Let us begin with a single hunt. A sea otter dives to the seafloor, uses its sensitive front paws to pry a sea urchin from a rocky crevice, and tucks the prey under its armpit to carry it back to the surface. Many otters place a stone on their chest like an anvil, then strike hard-shelled prey against it until the shell breaks open. However, not every otter uses tools, and tools are not used during every hunt. This behavior varies depending on the individual and the type of prey. Sea otters must hunt almost constantly because they do not have a thick layer of blubber like seals. To maintain their body temperature, they need to eat an amount of food equal to about 25% of their body weight every day. For an otter weighing 23 kilograms, that is approximately 7 kilograms of food, or roughly 50 sea urchins. 50 sea urchins for every otter, every day, day after day. Now multiply that by 1,000 sea otters living along 300 miles of California coastline. The sea urchin population does not collapse immediately. What happens is even more effective. The surviving urchins realize that open water is dangerous. They retreat. They return to the rocky crevices they once left when the otters disappeared. They stop moving. They stop forming feeding fronts. They stop eating the holdfasts that anchor kelp to the seafloor. At Monterey, Joshua Smith's research showed that in areas with dense kelp, most sea urchins remained hidden in crevices. In urchin barrens, however, they crawled openly across the seafloor and actively fed on living kelp. After the 2014 outbreak, the number of sea otters in the study area increased from about 269 to 432, while their consumption of sea urchins tripled. In reality, sea otters eat sea urchins, crabs, mussels, clams, and many other invertebrates. Sea urchins are therefore not always their only prey. But in places where the urchins are fat and rich in nutrients, otters may hunt them with extraordinary intensity. As pressure from the urchins decreases, kelp holdfasts are no longer constantly destroyed. Under favorable conditions, giant kelp can grow by as much as 60 centimeters per day, like an underwater structure rebuilding itself one level at a time. The forest canopy gradually returns. Rockfish move into the kelp during the very first season. Lingcod follow. Then come cabezon, senorita fish, and kelp bass. Harbor seals return to rest on the floating kelp canopy near the surface. Sea lions begin hunting among the towering columns of kelp. Species that had been absent from some parts of the California coast for 40 years returned within just 5 years of the otter's arrival. Not because anyone brought them there, and not because anyone planted a habitat for them. They detected the presence of the kelp and came back on their own. In 2016, a researcher from the Monterey Bay Aquarium placed an underwater camera inside a recovering kelp forest near Moss Landing. She had gone there to count fish. Instead, she captured footage of a mother sea otter floating on her back with her pup resting on her chest. The pup watched closely as its mother struck a sea urchin against a stone. Then it reached out with its small, still clumsy front paws and tried to imitate the movement. The mother placed the stone in the pup's paws and guided its motion. The pup struck downward, and the shell broke open. The mother sea otter was teaching her pup how to use a tool. The video was viewed 40 million times. The historical sea otter population once numbered 300,000. Their current range extends for about 300 miles along the California coast. Their historical range stretched for more than 1,000 miles. Today, the southern sea otter population numbers approximately 3,200. However, at the northern edge of their range, the otters have barely expanded for more than 20 years, even though the waters beyond still contain abundant food. What is stopping them is not sea urchins, but great white sharks. Scientists examined 1,870 sea otter carcasses recovered along the California coast since 1985. The results showed that cases involving shark bite wounds rose sharply after 2003. In recent decades, shark-related mortality increased by about 3 times across the otter's entire range and by as much as 8 times at the southern edge. During some periods, more than half of the recovered carcasses showed signs of shark bites. In fact, great white sharks do not actually want to eat sea otters. They may take an exploratory bite after mistaking the shape of an otter at the surface for a seal. After biting, the shark usually swims away because sea otters do not have a thick layer of blubber. But the wound can still be severe enough to kill the animal through blood loss or internal injuries. Faced with the risk that the last remaining sea otters could disappear, the U.S. government once tried to establish a backup population off San Nicolas Island. From 1987 to 1990, the government captured and relocated 140 sea otters from California's central coast to San Nicolas Island, more than 60 miles from the mainland. But the otters did not follow the human plan. Most of them left the island only days after being released. Some swam back to their original range, while others moved into new areas or died during the journey. Within 3 years, no more than about 17 otters remained, including 14 adults and 3 pups. Later recovery documents determined that the founding population had fallen to only about 12 or 13 animals. The program was initially judged to have failed to meet its goals. For many years, the population grew very slowly. However, it did not disappear. The otters reproduced, expanded their feeding grounds, and gradually formed a true community. During the decade before the 2019 survey, the number of otters at San Nicolas increased by an average of about 10% each year, reaching nearly 100 animals. A program once viewed as an almost complete failure ultimately created California's second population of southern sea otters. But moving adult otters to an island solved only part of the problem. In the wild, many sea otter pups lose their mothers because of illness, injury, or because the mother no longer has enough energy to continue caring for them. Humans can feed these pups, but teaching them to become wild otters is not easy. They must learn how to dive, search for prey beneath the sand, open mussel shells, care for their fur, and live among other otters without depending on people. Remarkably, the idea that helped solve this problem emerged at the Monterey Bay Aquarium in 2001, thanks to Tula, a female otter who had recently lost her own pup. Tula adopted an orphaned otter known as number 217, held him on her chest, shared food with him, and taught him the instincts he needed to survive in the wild. The result was extraordinary. Just 4 days after returning to the ocean, Otter 217 was diving and catching prey on his own. He lived successfully in the wild for 11 years and fathered several later generations. Over the course of her life, Tula became a devoted foster mother to 13 orphaned otters, 10 of which successfully returned to the wild. Thanks to this great mother and a coordinated program that operated from 2002 to 2016, 37 orphaned otters were released into Elkhorn Slough. They and their descendants contributed more than half of the population growth there, transforming a once nearly empty stretch of water into a thriving, multi-generational sea otter community. When the otters returned, their influence extended far beyond the growth of their own population. At Elkhorn Slough, they ate crabs, setting off a chain reaction that helped seagrass thrive, stabilize the shoreline, and improve the entire estuary ecosystem. Sea otter recovery efforts produced results far greater than simply saving one species from extinction. A study published in 2024 compared maps of California's kelp forests from 1910, 1912, with data from 2014, 2016, and found a striking contrast. Along the central California coast, where sea otters had recovered, kelp canopy area increased by 57.6%. Meanwhile, Northern California lost 63%, while Southern California saw a decline of 52.1%. In the analytical model, sea otter density was the strongest factor explaining this difference, alongside extreme temperatures, seafloor structure, and biological productivity. Both coastal regions experienced the same marine heat waves and ocean fluctuations. Yet one still maintained kelp columns, towering dozens of meters high, while the other became a rocky wasteland covered with sea urchins. Sea otters are not the only factor, but their presence can determine whether a forest remains resilient or crosses the point of collapse. However, they are not a miracle solution. Long-term research has shown that when sea otters returned to Vancouver Island, sea urchin numbers quickly declined and kelp recovered. But around San Nicolas Island, sea otters, sea urchins, and kelp have coexisted at moderate densities for many years. The outcome also depends on the type of kelp, the available food supply, and the structure of each individual ecosystem. Remember how we said that sea otters still have not returned to Northern California? So what controlled the sea urchins there in their absence? The answer was the sunflower sea star, one of the largest sea stars in the world. It can grow nearly 3 feet across and have as many as 20 arms. Then, in 2013, a mysterious wasting disease spread along the west coast of North America. The sea stars developed lesions, their bodies softened, and their arms began to twist before separating from the central disc. Within just a few days, a large animal could break down into a mass of tissue on the seafloor. From 2013 to 2017, the outbreak wiped out more than 90% of sunflower sea stars across much of their range. From Washington to Mexico, declines in many locations were estimated to exceed 97%. At almost the same time, a massive body of unusually warm water known as the blob spread across the northeastern Pacific Ocean. The warm, nutrient-poor water slowed kelp growth, while the amount of dead kelp drifting down to the seafloor fell sharply. Now imagine what happened next. The predator that kept sea urchins under control disappeared, while the urchins' safer food supply also began to run out. Purple sea urchins started leaving their rocky crevices, crawling into the open, and feeding directly on living kelp. Some areas lost more than 90% of their kelp forests within only a few years. That is why scientists are no longer focusing only on restoring sea otters. They are also trying to bring back the sunflower sea star. At several laboratories, hundreds of juvenile sea stars are being raised separately because they may eat one another. One young sea star, only about the size of a hamburger, once consumed 44 small purple sea urchins in a single day and still appeared hungry. Researchers are sequencing the DNA of each individual, selecting breeding pairs to preserve genetic diversity, and freezing millions of sperm cells and hundreds of thousands of larvae for future generations. NOAA has invested $18 million in an initiative to restore kelp forests and key species along the West Coast. However, scientists estimate that at least 5 more years of preparation may be needed before laboratory-raised sunflower sea stars can be released into the wild. Then, a sign of hope appeared. In 2024, a commercial sea urchin diver discovered a wild sunflower sea star inside the Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuary. The following year, scientific divers found another small group in the same area. Perhaps a few had survived the underwater pandemic. And just like the small group of sea otters that once remained hidden near Big Sur, those few survivors could become the starting point for the return of an entire species and offer Northern California's kelp forests another chance to recover. In conclusion, the future of California's kelp forests is still far from secure. Sea otters are protecting the patches of forest that remain. Sunflower sea stars are being bred in hopes that they can one day return to the ocean floor, and divers must continue removing sea urchins from the most severely damaged areas. But ocean temperatures are still rising, sea urchins continue to cover vast stretches of rocky seafloor, and most sea otters remain confined to a relatively narrow section of coastline. What California is learning is that no single species can save an entire ecosystem on its own. Sea otters, sea stars, kelp, fish, and humans are all interconnected links in the same chain. When one link disappears, the consequences can spread throughout the entire ocean. But when those missing links are restored in time, nature may still be able to heal itself in ways that machines and money can never replace. What do you think? Should people continue removing sea urchins by hand? Or should we focus more on restoring natural predators such as sea otters and sunflower sea stars? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories about the ways nature can heal itself, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next journey.